What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lamby here for Working Weights LLC, your guide to strength, health, and all things nutrition. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Dwarrell.
Hey guys, good to see you.
And today we are talking about low-carb diets. All right, Dwayne, how's the weather?
Hey, so just was we were just talking about this. So the weather got a little cold down here in Houston, Texas, and so my pipes froze, and just by a series of miracles, got the pipes, got the water flowing again, and man, I sure appreciate water.
Yeah, it's a good
Sure
thing to
appreciate
have.
it. Amen, amen. That's right. It's good, good, good. So.
Yeah. So hope everybody fared as well as Dwayne out there in my old stomping grounds. So I
Yep,
know it got cold.
yep, yep, yep.
Yeah.
Of course, for Texans, I mean, especially down here, down south, like Houston, Galveston area, San Antonio, wherever down here. So if you're in the teens or just low 20s, that's pretty serious stuff for us. Now, compared to Justin, we had on our podcast like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago,
Yeah.
um, where he did a
We had
marathon in minus
negative
20
-20. Yeah.
degrees.
Minus 20 Celsius.
That's why when
Jeez.
that podcast, I was going, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy because, oh man, yeah. So this would be balmy to him, but
hmm
yeah, it gives me a whole new appreciation for even what Coach Lamby's going through up there with that snow. There you go.
Yeah. So it warmed up over here. A lot of the snow is gone. We saw it. There's still some piles, where the trees provide
Yeah,
shade all day.
yeah,
So a lot of it's disappearing. Weather's getting back up into the high 40s, low 50s. So
yeah.
I think that part of the winter is maybe gone for us. Still going to be cool, and that's a nice reprieve from the summer heat that I'm always used to. So
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. By the way, this is 40s, 50s, low 60. Great
yeah.
workout weather.
Oh yeah.
It's great workout weather. I'm telling you.
Good. Yeah. Good. Not so much for me up here because the garage here is just a frigid
That's
dungeon. So,
true. That's
uh,
true. That's true.
yeah.
I'm going to tell a secret on him. So what you don't know, he might have it right now. Coach Lambie has like a fire pit next to him over there with burning embers, and
Oh yeah.
yeah,
I have a propane heater behind me. I have a little uh plug-in heater for my feet down there, and then I have one going above my head. So my little podcast area gets nice and warm. I can't tend to heat this whole area very well, but it gets warm enough to get the job done when I'm working out. So
cool, awesome,
that's what it is. Yeah, man.
awesome.
So let's talk about the low carb diets.
Yes,
We are middle of January here, coming up towards the end. Everybody is working on their New Year's resolutions, and I know a lot of people went low carb. It's been very, very popular for quite some time now. There's a lot of proponents of the diet online. And if you were to look up diets, that's probably one of the main things you're going to get. So maybe I thought a good time to talk about low carb diets, how I would kind of run through a low carb diet if I was coaching someone through that, and talking about the long-term efficacy of these things. So most of what we're going to hear about them online, the information that people are going to get is going to be relatively short, very, very controlled trials as the evidence. And something that spurred this topic for me is this meta-analysis was just released on LDL cholesterol and low carbohydrate diets. And so this is making its rounds through the low carb community, the keto and carnivore particularly. And so this is kind of being touted as evidence that, so there's been this war on saturated fat between the mainstream nutrition recommendations and the quote unquote low carb community. And so this meta analysis is being pushed out in these low carb social media communities as kind of like proof that saturated fat is not having an effect on our LDL cholesterol. And so this is an interesting meta-analysis. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is new. It is being pushed out there as proof that
Hey,
saturated
hey,
fat. Yeah, go ahead.
hey, Coach. I'm sorry. I know you're about to get on a roll, and I'm super excited about it, and I'm sure everybody else is. But one of the things that I kind of want to keep in the back of your mind,
Mhm.
and that we can circle back to probably later, is that the people that I know that are all about low carb diets is because they see like a fairly quick weight
Mhm.
loss. And so then that word gets around, oh, I'm doing a low carb diet.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, so people are going to drop some pounds. And but then with the long term, like you were talking about the long term efficacy and about what that means to your health and nutrition.
Yep.
So just keep that in the back of everybody's mind and go.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So everything we're going to look at today is going to be long-term stuff. And I, specifically brought up the long-term stuff because there is a ton of short-term evidence and so we are going to talk a little bit about it. But yeah, like in the short term, and we mentioned this in the cholesterol, or no, it was blood
Yes,
sugar. It
yes,
was the
blood
blood
sugar.
sugar episode.
Yes,
Um, that yeah, short-term trials, short-term evidence, and particularly what you're talking about, anecdotes, which is people's own personal experience.
yes,
Um, yeah, it's very, very robust evidence there that it does work particularly well at reducing body weight, at reducing body fat, and in the short term, um, reducing blood glucose to an extent here. So yeah, we'll talk about all that. I kind of want to give people the long term
absolutely,
aspect of this too. So
absolutely.
because you're
That's
going to
the
hear
goal.
all, yeah, you're going to hear all about the short-term stuff online. And
Yes,
yeah, there's no argument against the short-term stuff. Absolutely not. So but it is the longer term thing. And the practical takeaways that people can take away from this, how I would utilize a low carbohydrate diet if I was coaching
yes,
someone through these processes.
right.
So, getting to this meta-analysis here. So, in the conclusion, they say a substantial increase in LDL cholesterol is likely for individuals with low but not high BMI with consumption of low-carb diet, findings that may help guide individualized nutrition management of a cardiovascular risk, as carbohydrate restriction tends to improve other lipid and non-lipid risk factors. The clinical significance of isolated LDL cholesterol elevation in this context warrants investigation. Um, and this is kind of a group of people that want to so the theory is that high LDL, if you are extremely lean, this is that lean mass hyper responder that we were talking about. Extremely lean individuals on a low carbohydrate diet see these really high increases in LDL cholesterol. And so the hypothesis is that in that case where you're really lean, really active, otherwise metabolically healthy, that this elevation in LDL doesn't have an impact on your risk of cardiovascular disease or atherosclerosis. So this meta-analysis will just get down here to some of the stuff. So here's these forest plots where they categorize these by BMI. So we have less than 25, 25 to 30,
That's a
30,
little
and
that's a little small, coach. Can't see it.
yeah, it's unfortunately I can't make this one bigger. Let me see.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. Oh, look at
It's not
there.
going to be very much bigger.
Oh, it's huge.
Uh, all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they just categorize these forest plots between BMI. So less than 25, 25 to 30, 30 and 35, and then over 35. And then we can see how the BMI correlates with changes in LDL cholesterol during these trials. See if I can get.
No, that was good right there, what you did. That was fine.
All right. Yeah. And then going down, they have some linear graphs here showing that they adjusted for certain things. So we have low carbohydrate diets and all trials excluding statins. This is IPD. I forget what that stands for. And so a low carbohydrate and a high carbohydrate diet, IPD. And so what they're showing here is that the LDL cholesterol change has a better correlation between BMI than it does with saturated fat intake. However, they do provide this chart, which does show. So we have, let me see if I can blow this up.
That's good. That's good.
All right. So we have saturated fat intake here on the right. So 7%, 14%, 21%, and then baseline BMI. And so you can kind of see that there does seem to be an effect from both of these things. So as BMI goes down, this effect on LDL cholesterol goes up. And as saturated fat intake goes up, so does the effect of LDL cholesterol.
Wow.
And so this on the left, this is low carb. On the right, this is higher carb.
Wow.
They also have these forest plots here. So these charts are mainly what they're using to suggest that saturated fat. So they've separated saturated fat by quartiles, so fourths, and so we can see that on a low carbohydrate diet, high carbohydrate diet, adjusted for weight loss on both of those, saturated fat doesn't seem to change even, or I'm sorry, LDL cholesterol doesn't seem to change even as the intake of saturated fat goes up. And what we are actually seeing is that on according to BMI, that LDL cholesterol seems to change according to BMI. Now, the problems that I have with utilizing this meta-analysis to say that saturated fat doesn't have an impact on LDL cholesterol and BMI does can be summed up really well in their limitations paragraph here. So 9 trials did not report saturated fat consumption. Now, if we take, there's 41 trials included in this meta-analysis. And if we take 9 times 41, or I'm sorry, 9 divided by 41 times 100, we come out with about 22%. So roughly 1/4 of the trials that they included in this meta-analysis didn't even report the very thing that they are trying to assess.
Wow.
Okay, so
That's
that is a
crazy.
limitation there. Yeah, and they acknowledge that that somewhat diminishes their ability to compare the influence of this dietary factor with BMI. Somewhat diminishes it. I think that it would be a little more than somewhat. They also go on to say that this trial Diet Fits, which is done by Christopher Gardner, had more participants than the other trials included in the IPD combined. So this one trial that they included in here had more participants in it than all the other trials combined. Okay, meaning that this one trial holds the most amount of weight in this meta-analysis. And both arms in this trial, so this was a healthy low carb diet and a healthy low fat diet, and both arms were advised to restrict saturated fat intake. Okay, so they go on to admit that their IPD analysis may have underestimated the relative influence of saturated fat intake on LDL-C change for people with obesity. They have a whole bunch more. And then in the last tier, finally, because comparisons were made across baseline BMI level without the protection of randomization, which would be experimentally infeasible, BMI could be a marker rather than a mediator of the observed relationships with LDL-C change. And so I think that so number one, this is a meta-regression. It is a meta-analysis, but it is a meta-regression. And a meta-regression is an observational analysis. Okay, so even though they used randomized control trials to perform this meta-analysis, the meta-regression itself is observational. Okay, and so what we're seeing is a correlation between BMI and LDL change, and not so much the saturated fat intake and LDL change. But we also have the Keys equation, okay, developed by Ansel Keys, And the Keyes equation takes in the amount of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fat and will tell us we can actually predict the changes in serum cholesterol based on saturated fat and polyunsaturated fat intake. And so this meta-analysis would have to invalidate the Keyes equation, which has never been invalidated, in order for these correlations to be correct. So rather than this meta-analysis actually being evidence that saturated fat doesn't have an effect on LDL cholesterol and BMI does, I think this is a great example of correlation doesn't equal causation here.
Right.
All right.
Right. In a roundabout way by their own admission too.
Yes, so they admit that they have several limitations to this, which I think are larger than they are admitting.
Right.
When we look at, there's also a notion that in these particular people on a low carbohydrate diet, that LDL levels don't tend to have an impact on atherosclerosis or cardiovascular disease. But we have lots and lots of data going back decades and decades on cholesterol levels, particularly LDL and ApoB more recently, and their effects on atherosclerotic diseases. And so this analysis here is one of them. And we have Mendelian randomization studies, prospective cohort studies. Sorry.
Wow. It
Yeah.
is cold there.
I can't talk. Yeah. And randomized control trials. And we can see that the magnitude of exposure to lower LDL-C, okay, so the lower your LDL cholesterol are for longer in your life, we can see the proportional reduction in risk. So higher LDL for longer in life leads to higher levels of risk of coronary heart disease. Okay. And this isn't, you know what I mean? This is from all kinds of different lines of evidence converging on one point, telling us, yes, higher LDL levels do tend to increase risk. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed to give you a heart attack or something, right? But
Right.
we're talking about an increase in risk. We have this, so this systematic review and dose response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies here. And going back to this graph here, this is just another form of evidence here that shows as total cholesterol goes up, which would include LDL cholesterol, hazard ratio goes up, and you can see that this response is linear, right? We saw that in the other graph too. So we have multiple lines of evidence. There are multiple different labs and researchers all coming up to the same evaluation. Now I want to talk about saturated fat because the push for the specific type of low carbohydrate diet that people are getting online is going to be one that is high in saturated fat, high in animal proteins. Again, there's kind of a notion that it tends to be circular reasoning, is that saturated fat and LDL cholesterol aren't risk factors or things you need to worry about on a low carb diet because it's on a low carb diet, or that these things have never been studied in the context of a low carbohydrate diet. But we don't actually necessarily need to have to study them in that context, because we have lots and lots of evidence on saturated fat, LDL cholesterol, all these other things from a whole bunch of different diets, right? So across populations, some people are going to be doing low carbohydrate diets, some people are not, and it's all included together. Okay, so there will be certain studies or meta-analysis that show no relationship between saturated fat and what is called all-cause mortality, or even cardiovascular mortality, coronary heart disease mortality. And so those things do exist. Now, the problem in assessing saturated fat, and number one with all-cause mortality, that seems to be a big thing in the low-carb groups. So all-cause mortality includes things like um, lung cancer, uh, death from diseases like HIV, SARS-CoV-2, getting hit by a truck. And so when we look at meta-analysis that say, well, we found no correlation between saturated fat intake and all-cause mortality, that's not telling us a lot because we wouldn't expect saturated fat to have any effect on deaths from COVID, right? Or lung cancer. We wouldn't expect
Well, but
saturated.
Bob,
Yeah.
saturated fats and how you drive that truck. Come on. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a study out there for that somewhere. I'm telling
Yeah.
you right now.
So
Oh, wow.
So, in regards to all cause mortality, we just wouldn't expect saturated fat to have an impact on all these different forms of mortality. So, that is a result that we would expect to find from the trial design, right? Now, when it comes to saturated fat and its effect on cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease, it's important that you have to take into account who the population that's being looked at is. So normally dietary intakes across populations are relatively homogeneous, meaning that they don't tend to differ that much across a nation. So if we looked at the saturated fat intake for Spain, we would find that most everyone is generally within the same range. Okay. And so if you're looking at an intake of, the lowest intake of saturated fat being 12% and the highest saturated fat being 16%, well, we wouldn't expect to see a whole bunch of difference there, right?
No.
Because the magnitude of comparison that we're looking at just isn't high enough to give us an effect. Okay.
Right. Right.
And so that mostly is going to explain a lot of these analysis where we see no association between saturated fat and these mortality outcomes or incidents of coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and stuff like that. When we compare populations, so for example, we looked at the Nurses Health Study, or we looked at red meat intake
Hmm.
versus the Nurses Health Studies and the health professional follow-up. And when we looked at the lowest intake versus the highest intake, the lowest intake, right, of red meat was like a quarter of a serving, and the highest intake was almost 3.
Right.
And so that magnitude of effect gives us a better understanding of the dose response relationship there. Okay. Also, when we look at substitution analyses, okay, so this, and all of these are going to be in the show notes. And so this meta-analysis here, systematic review and meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies, looks at substituting polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat with saturated fat. So if we replace 5% of energy from saturated fat with monounsaturated fat, what happens? Do we tend to see a reduction in risk, an increase in risk? And so what we see is that when we replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat and monounsaturated fat, we see reductions in risk. Okay. So that tells us that there is an effect of an increase in risk from saturated fat, because when we look at replacing it with other things, even just 5%, we tend to see these reductions in risk. All right. So that's kind of it for the saturated fat. Did I make clear, understandable?
I understood it, but as the
Okay.
everyday ombudsman, I'm going, did everybody get that? I think so. I think it's clear enough.
Okay.
I think it's clear enough.
Yeah. All
Yes.
right. So another big um, advantage or claim to have an advantage from these low carb diets is the impact on glycemic control, particularly for people with diabetes. And so going back to the how to lower your blood sugar episode, we went over the Verta Health trial. And so I'm not going to belabor this point here, but we have our baseline HbA1c was 7.6, after 2 years was 6.6, and then at 3 years was 7.4 from the Verta Health trial, right? So we can see that long term, In terms of glycemic control, the Virta Health trial here didn't seem to have a huge effect on it. Short term, it was fantastic, right? Brought it down from
Hmm.
7.6 to 6.2. Long
Right.
term, we're not seeing this huge benefit of effect. Now, we talked a little bit last time about Jason Fung, and he's a big proponent of fasting along with a ketogenic style diet. And so he has a couple of uh, case studies that he's presented in the literature, and more power to him for presenting case studies, because a lot of the doctors in that community are not producing case studies. They'll just tell you about all of the success that they're seeing with their patients, but they're not putting out case studies, right? Because these have to be peer reviewed. And so he has, we have 3 participants right here. One of them was on this fasting protocol along with ketogenic diet. We have 7 months, 11 months, and 11 months. And so we're going to go down and look at these HbA1c. So the first patient here came in with an HbA1c of 11.96, so basically 12. And after 7 months, it dropped down to 7.5.
That's
So
traumatic.
definitely a traumatic decrease. And we can see this line chart here represents what the HbA1c looks like over time. So what we are starting to see here, even though this is definitely a dramatic decrease, it definitely puts this person into a lower risk category. We can see that this line here does seem to start trending back up towards the end of their time on this fasting protocol. Now, all of these patients did come off of a lot of their medications too, which again is definitely a good thing, right? Puts them in a lower risk category. Patient 2 started out at 7.2, at the end came to 6.6, but we see this sucker bouncing around all over the place, right? And this is a 11-month trial. And then participant 3, again, we see same thing here. Started out at 6.3, ended out at 6.2, which is not a dramatic drop over 11 months. And we can see this bouncing around. So what this kind of tells me is that this protocol that these people are going through tended to be relatively hard to adhere to.
Hmm.
And so I've read Jason Fung's books, and so I know that these are like 24 to 36 hour, sometimes even 48-hour fasts. And then on the days you do eat, it's about 800 calories. So this
Hmm.
could be very, very hard for most people to stick to. And then based on the HbA1c, from the beginning to the end, uh, it does this, it is lower. Okay. Don't get me wrong. It is lower, but this is not the magnitude of effect that is being claimed online.
Right. I
All right.
agree.
So what's being claimed online is that these trials or this method of eating is reversing diabetes, and people are using the word cure, but from the long-term outcomes that we're seeing here, that just doesn't tend to be the case. Short term, sure.
Yeah, it's hard to adhere to,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yep. And so here's another one from Jason Fung. This is a 4-month case study.
Hold on a second. Let me
And
ask you a quick question.
go ahead.
So the quick, so the the ridiculous ride in those charts.
Mhm.
Uh, is it what's the impact on your body for that? I mean, so you're doing the intermittent fasting, and then the days that you're eating, maybe 800 calories, maybe more.
Mhm.
Just a back and forth of that. So like long term, it's we're not really seeing that it's sustainable, and
Mhm.
so what kind of ride is that? Kind of mental process is that trying to control that? And so what I'm saying is that um, that's hard for somebody to stay consistent with. It's like I'm not gonna. They'll do that for a while because hey, they read the book and so they're eating and hey, I'm gonna heal my
Yeah.
LDL. But what's the word I'm looking for? You and I talk about it all the time about sustainability.
Mhm.
You can't sustain that.
Right. Yeah. Not for extreme extended periods of time. So about 1 year seems to be the longest level of adherence that we're seeing.
I've never
Now,
seen anybody go a year doing this. Never seen anybody do that.
I personally haven't either, but what's available to us within the scientific literature, about a year tends to be the sustainability of high adherence to these diets. And so the stricter the diet becomes, the harder it is to adhere to as well.
Right.
Yeah, and so here another case study by Jason Fung. So HbA1c at the beginning was 7.7 and at the end was 7.2. You know, again, I mean, is this better than any alternative that's out there? I don't think so. These people are losing a ton of weight, so we can see the change in kilograms here. And I think it was in the chart here, right? So from 92.6 kilograms to 76.1, like pretty significant drop in weight. So it's not to say that there's not a benefit from a weight loss standpoint, but you know, the claim on glycemic control long term doesn't seem to be there. And then again, we go back to this lean mass hyperresponder comparison between the keto group and the Miami Heart group. And as far as HbA1c goes, in the keto group, it's 5.4. In the Miami Heart, it's 5.5. And the Miami Heart is not an intervention trial, by the way. This is a prospective cohort, kind of like the Nurses Health Study, where they're not looking to intervene in people's diets. They're just assessing intake through questionnaires. And then the Miami Heart Trial is also using coronary angiogram to look at changes in atherosclerotic plaque buildup basically over time. And then they're probably going to end up stratifying that by dietary intake. So carbohydrate, high quality versus low quality, fat, high quality versus low quality, animal versus plant, all that stuff. So, but we can see, so these were people on a ketogenic diet for at least 4.5 years, and there just isn't a conferred benefit as far as glycemic control goes long term here.
Yeah. In fact, by the way, look at the side of that. It's 5.4 and 5.5, but
Mm-hmm.
plus or minus 3 and plus or
Uh-huh.
minus 2. So they're almost identical. The only
Yeah.
change that I'd see that was anything that was like significant was the LDL between
Yeah.
those two diets. But
Yeah, and that's going back to, so the same people who are doing this lean mass hyperresponder coronary angiogram trial here are the same ones who are responsible for writing this
right,
meta-analysis that we talked about in the beginning. So it's the same people,
right.
and they're trying to make the case that high LDL levels on a low carbohydrate diet, if you're lean and quote unquote metabolically healthy, don't tend to increase your risk of cardiovascular disease or atherosclerotic diseases. And so lastly, getting down to the end here is parsing through what's available in the scientific literature and looking at the outcomes from that is one thing. The definition of what a low carbohydrate diet is within the scientific community versus the way that it is practiced in real life are two different things here. And looking at the long-term mortality outcomes on the way that low carbohydrate diets are practiced within the broader US population does not look very promising. Okay, so dietary carbohydrate intake and mortality, a prospective cohort study and meta-analysis. So over 25 years, 6,000 deaths, and percentage of 50 to 55% of energy from carbohydrate was associated with the lowest risk of mortality. And so both low carbohydrate consumption, less than 40%, and high carbohydrate consumption, over 70%, conferred the greatest mortality risk. So what they're showing here is there's this U-shape curve. I don't know if I can find the chart in here. Oh, looky there. Yeah, so here you go. All
That's
right,
funny.
so energy percent from carbohydrates, and the ketogenic community really wants you way down here at this end, and so we can see the hazard ratio. The lower in carbohydrates you go, that hazard ratio really tends to shoot way up, and we can see the confidence intervals here are fairly tight.
Yeah.
Okay, And then, of course, going up in the other direction, energy from percent of carbohydrate. You also see this increases risk, however, not as drastic as the other end of this thing. All right, we have here the association of low carbohydrate diets and low fat diets with mortality among US adults. And this one, along with a couple of these other analyses, I like because they have stratified these based on what we talked about this with when we talked with Patrick Elliott and categorizing different diets into healthy versus unhealthy. So we have a few here that's stratified. So we have unhealthy low carbohydrate diets and unhealthy low fat. And we can see overall an increase in risk. And then we have healthy low carbohydrate diet versus healthy low fat, and we can see decrease in risk all on the side, right? So
Pretty
in the
significant, several
unhealthy,
points.
yeah, on the unhealthy, we see that it is on the positive side of the one line here.
Yeah.
Versus the healthy side, right, is on the
Right.
negative side. So conferring a reduction in risk for both of these diets. And low carbohydrate diet score and mortality among US adults with incident type 2 diabetes. And let me see if we can blow this up. So here we see total low carbohydrate diet score, which is the red. So we see a reduction in risk. Animal low carbohydrate diet score right here. So a small reduction in risk. Vegetable low, which is this one here, right? And then unhealthy up here versus the healthy. So we can see that a vegetable low carbohydrate diet score and the healthy low carbohydrate diet score, meaning what is the difference between healthy and unhealthy? So if you are doing these low carbohydrate diets based on a lot of the boxed products, highly processed products that you're going to find in the store that have the words low carb or low net carb, or some of them say keto, versus a minimally processed whole foods diet. All right. And then we can see the difference here between the animal-based version of the diet and the plant-based version of the diet. All right. And another one, low carbohydrate diet. Low carbohydrate diets and all-cause mortality, systematic review and meta-analysis. So the risk of all-cause mortality among those with low carbohydrate diet score was significantly elevated, 31% increase in risk.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I
All
was looking
cause
for the,
mortality among those with a high low carbohydrate score.
yeah.
Wow.
And so um, someone might say, well, what about the saturated fat and the all-cause mortality versus the the whole, low carbohydrate diet aspect? Saturated fat, we're looking at a particular nutrient within a diet, right? And its effect. So again, we wouldn't expect to see saturated fat having a big effect on something like lung cancer, right? But an overall dietary pattern is going to have effects on multiple different things, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just going to be an effect on coronary heart disease or something. It's also going to have an effect on other different types of cancers. So breast cancer, prostate cancer, all these other different types of things. Okay, so that's why you're seeing an increase in risk in the all-cause mortality from the total low carbohydrate dietary pattern here. And another one here. So again, our nurses' health study and our health professionals' follow-up study. All right. So total mortality. We're seeing change in the animal-based low carbohydrate diets from below to above the median was associated with higher all-cause mortality. Okay. So basically what this is saying is that the higher the consumption of animal-based low carbohydrate diets, we see higher increase in all-cause mortality. All right, and this one here, last but not least, low carbohydrate diets and all-cause and cause-specific mortality, population-based cohort study and pooling of prospective studies. And we can see here that the higher the the more adherent to a low carbohydrate diet you are, the more the hazard ratio increases for all cause and cause specific mortality.
So you need to say that again.
I need to say it again. Okay.
Yeah. Higher
Higher the adherence to a low
low
carbohydrate
carb diet.
diet,
Yes.
the higher the hazard ratio for all
For all
cause
cause
and cause
mortality.
specific mortality. So cause specific being cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, cancer, that type of stuff. And then you have all cause. Okay.
That's very interesting. And the way this chart puts it there, so everything we've looked at so far is kind of summed up in that chart, which is just kind of
Right.
mind blowing. It's mind
Yeah.
blowing.
So summing everything up, let's get to the practical application here. Okay. So long term, the way people are practicing low carbohydrate diets and specifically the advice you're getting online leads
Right.
to higher mortality rates amongst
Yep.
those who are more adherent to these low carbohydrate diets. Okay. So going forward, let's say that a low carbohydrate diet resonates with you. Maybe you have done one in the past and you saw some benefits. So there definitely are people who do tend to do very well on these diets long term. Okay. And that's probably the best diet that they can do for themselves. Okay. Now that's a very, very small subset of the people who are doing them, and even smaller of the total population. So let's say you do want to do this diet, you have done in the past, you found great success, you found it hard to be adherent to. Okay. Long term, if you wanted to do it long term, we can see very clearly that the more plant-based protein and fat you have in the diet, that tends to reduce the risk of mortality from a low carbohydrate diet.
Right.
The higher the animal protein and fat intake, the
Yep.
higher the risk of mortality
Right.
and cardiovascular disease and stuff. So long term, if you wanted to do this long term, my advice would be more plant-based sources of protein and fat. That doesn't mean that you have to be completely vegan or vegetarian, right?
Right.
So we can see
Right.
that even replacing just 5% of total energy leads to reductions in risk. Okay.
Right. Right.
So we've talked about this a lot. Hopefully there's a theme bouncing through our episodes here. So if you were, you have so many meals per day, which equates to so many meals per week. And so if you're having red meat or higher saturated fat intakes out of 2 or 3 of those meals per week, 2 or 3 meals per week, you're using some sort of plant-based alternative meat. 2 or 3 meals per week, you're getting, tofu, beans, lentils, that kind of stuff. 2 or 3 times per week, you're getting some fatty fish. 2 or 3 times per week, you're getting chicken, turkey, or some other form of poultry. Okay.
Yep.
And so that's
Yep.
probably going to be one of the best ways that you can do it. And then using a lot of the polyunsaturated or just unsaturated fats in general, which are going to come in the form of oils, liquid at room
Yes.
temperature. That's what we're looking for.
Right. Right.
All right. And then short-term approaches. Okay. So let's say you really, really like beef and the saturated fat and everything that comes from that. So how would we do this? Again, a periodized approach. Okay. So utilizing this specific type of diet for a very short term. So let's say anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on how much weight you need to lose or whatever. And mainly people are using this for weight loss. Okay. Now, a lot of the initial weight loss that you're going to find is just going to be water weight. It's not coming in the form of fat.
Right.
Okay, so there does seem to be you'll see people out there dropping 12 pounds or more in the first couple of weeks.
Right.
And that's coming from water. Okay, so as you're reducing your carbohydrate intake, what you have stored in your muscles and in your liver is called glycogen. For every 1 gram of glycogen that is stored, you store 3 grams of water. So as your body starts to deplete its glycogen sources because you're not replenishing that with carbohydrate, you start to lose this water weight. Okay.
Right.
Now, over the course of 4 to 6 months, there's going to be fat lost. Okay. there isn't superior fat loss results from a low carbohydrate diet compared to any other. So basically, we're talking about is your ability to adhere to this diet. And many people do find it very easy to adhere because kind of the quote unquote rules to doing this are very simple. Don't eat carbohydrates.
Right. Yeah.
That's very, very easy to follow, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah, so utilizing this in a periodized approach where we would go through a fat loss phase. Remember, fat loss is a phase, it's not a lifestyle. So we could use this low carbohydrate diet, even if it was high in animal and saturated fats, for 3 to 6 months, get a whole bunch of weight off of you because it would be easy for you to follow. We reintroduce carbohydrates. We work on the long-term overall diet quality of you. We're going to go through a post-fat loss phase, and we're going to go through a maintenance phase. And then again, we would go through a pre-fat loss phase and then a fat loss phase. So that's how I would utilize this if I was coaching someone, if they found it very, very easy to adhere to these diets, which, a lot of people do. We would use it in this phasic structure. I would not advise this type of dietary approach for a really, really long term. So hopefully I've made a very good case that long term, it doesn't seem to be very beneficial, right? The diets, the way that they're being practiced in the population and the way that they are being advertised online. Okay, except for the plant-based versions. Those do tend to confer some benefit long term. Okay, the beef, bacon, eggs, and butter ones, not so much.
Right. 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 So, best case scenario, say if somebody, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this no carb diet because I want to lose 10 pounds, 12, 15 pounds. That's a perfect opportunity. So, okay, so you decide to do that. Fine. Don't expect to take that for long term. And in the midst of that, as you're cutting out carbs, that's a great time to overhaul your overall nutrition plan and start including more and more plant-based products. And like you said, oily fish, chicken. That's a great time to overhaul that nutrition plan as a whole.
Yeah.
So I know people that aren't like big salad people. They don't like salads. They don't like beans. They don't like this. They don't like that. But then when they bail out of the okay, well, I'm not going to eat carbs for like X amount of time.
Yeah.
Okay, great. But then they find this. Hey, beans aren't so bad. Hey, lentils not so bad. And then they overhaul their nutrition. If you could stick to that, then you're golden.
Yes. So the best time to work on that would be coming out of the fat loss phase. So that post-fat loss where we start to reintroduce different foods, and we're going to start to reintroduce carbohydrates because I think we talked about it before. Again, once you go on a low carbohydrate diet, high in saturated fat, there does tend to be a physiologic response for your muscles to become insulin resistant. And so in order, I don't think anyone can make a case that that's a good thing over a long period of time. So we want to reintroduce those carbohydrates. And so as
coming
we're
out
doing
of
that,
coming out of
that fat loss phase.
Right.
Yeah. So during that fat loss phase, if it ends up being beef, butter, bacon, and eggs that makes you adherent to this thing for a very short period of time, yeah, let's do it. It wouldn't be my first choice. But if that allows you to do it. So as we come out of that and we start to reintroduce things, that would be a great time to introduce these other beans, whole grains, fiber sources, and different plant-based proteins. So
right.
Yeah. And over the course of several years, you could work on just improving the overall quality of your diet where you get to a point where you're really, really happy with that thing. And so I tell people all the time, listen, it doesn't matter where you get in 6 months, it's where you get 6 years from now. Right.
Oh, that's true. So
just because you do this diet for 6 months, and you think it's going to be what you're going to do for the rest of your life, at 6 month mark, you made a bunch of progress, but you start to find it's hard to adhere to. What happens is you start reintroducing all of these junk foods back into your diet and you end up back where you were in the first place. So
Right.
Take your time
Right.
with it, right? And reach your goal over several years. That also makes the ability to adhere to this thing easier. So once you start stretching out the amount of time where it takes to get from where you are now to your goal, it's easier to get to. It's more adherent because you have less restriction, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
That's good. That's good stuff.
Good stuff. Let's cut it off here.
Cool.
Hopefully after editing, this one is a short one. And yeah, okay. So I hope somebody got something out there. I'm not sure if I blew any minds today, but yeah, I hope you guys take something away from it. If you have questions, send them to me, DustinLambert@workingweights.com. And we will see you guys next time. Coach Lamby and Dwayne out.
See you guys.